Hi everyone, in the last video I kind of gave you an outline of the structure of the class, how to get started on the class. In this video I want to give you a sense of how I envision the class and what I want you to gain from the class. And so just to start with, there's a lot of rhetoric out there that might say, why are we bothering to study the Middle Ages? Weren't the Middle Ages a pretty barbaric time that we're kind of glad that we moved on from? What is there really that the Middle Ages can teach us? And what I think I want you to recognize, what I want you to think about as you begin this class, and obviously you've chosen to take a class on the Middle Ages, so there's something about this period that interests you. And what I encourage you to think about is that the Middle Ages is a story of building. It's a story of building because it's the story of how the Mediterranean world responds to the fall of the Roman Empire, and the ways in which the Mediterranean world rebuilds after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had governed the Mediterranean region for such a long time, and it was built on the culture that had been established by ancient Greece in the Mediterranean region. And we're going to see in the early weeks of the class, in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the class, how that world, that ancient world that's been created, the world of Greece and Rome, disappears. How do the people of this region respond to that? How do they rebuild their society? And so I think a lot of times today there's a lot of language about how our own society is on the verge of massive changes, changes in the way that people live, that things that were taken for granted in the past are not assumed anymore. I think there's a lot for us to learn in the midst of what can be a very disorienting process, from looking at how a society that's a precursor to our own did this in the past. Maybe the changes that we're experiencing are not as traumatic as the changes that people experienced in the transition from the ancient world to the Mediterranean, the medieval world, the world of the Middle Ages. But there are certainly comparisons. And in that sense, the story of the Middle Ages is not a story of barbarism and failure. The story of the Middle Ages is a story of success. It's a story of building the culture, the Western culture, that would go on to dominate and play the leading influence in the history of the planet, the history of the whole planet, in the period immediately after this course, in the period from around 1500, really up until the modern day, at least up until, I think it's fair to say, 1950, 2000. So how is it that medieval people, how is it that the people of the Middle Ages were able to do this? What is the source of their great successes? So I want you to think about that as you're studying this course as well. This is a story of building. It's a story of successful building. The story of the Middle Ages is also a story of multiple different cultures. Many people tend to think that the story of the Middle Ages is the story of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe is certainly the most important society. It's the society that we're going to spend the most time on. But it's important to recognize that the history of the Middle Ages, the history of the Mediterranean region and how it responds to the fall of the Roman Empire, is based on 3 different societies. Not only medieval Europe, but also the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of the former Roman Empire that survives the fall of Rome, and the world of Islam in the Middle East and in North Africa and in parts of Europe. And so the story of the Middle Ages is a story of building. It's a story of successful building. It's a story of the interactions between different cultures. And so these are some of the reasons why the history of the Middle Ages is very relevant and very important to study in our own time. If we really believe that we're seeing some significant changes to the way people live, I think it's advantageous to look back in history and see how people responded to these changes before, how people built a society in a changing world before. We don't have to want to build the society that they built, but even that is a story of learning. And we're in a society where, or we're living in a time in which different societies are increasingly more connected than they've been before. The Middle Ages is a great way to study that sort of world as well. It's important to remember that the medieval Mediterranean was much closer to what we would consider a multicultural society than the Mediterranean in the centuries immediately after that, really in the centuries leading up to the 20th century. Before the 20th century, the period that we're looking at is probably one of the most multicultural periods and regions in the history of the world. So those are kind of the broader messages to think about when you're studying the Middle Ages. A couple that are more specific. Middle Ages was a period in which religion exercised an influence, a very significant influence. It is one of the periods when religion was most influential. So we want to look at that. What role does religion play in this society? In particular, what is the relationship between religion and the state? Are these purely theocratic regimes, or is there some kind of distinction between church and state? And this is also a period when there's not a lot of infrastructure. Why is there not a lot of infrastructure? Because the Roman Empire has fallen. That had provided the infrastructure previously. In a society without a lot of infrastructure, the contributions of individuals are magnified in importance. If your society has a lot of infrastructure, has a lot of shape to it, then there's a limit to what an individual can achieve. If your society has less infrastructure, then individuals are going to have more of an impact. And so the Middle Ages is a period where we don't see a lot of infrastructure. And therefore, we see individuals playing important roles in history. And this is something that we can lose sight of when we have the infrastructure of the modern world or more modern world in our other history classes. So I want you to think about the roles of individuals as leaders, the impact of individuals. So those are kind of some of the themes of this class I'd like you to think about as you're studying over the course of this semester. With that in mind, when it comes to the material for this class, and I thought this is an online class, there's a limit to how much immediate interaction we can have with one another. So what I wanted to give you was some of the great medieval texts. So we're going to read scholarship from scholars of the ancient world, as you see here in week 2. We're also going to read the most powerful, the most long-lasting texts, the most influential texts that were produced at this period. The Life of St. Anthony, Beowulf, early Islamic texts. Some of these texts, like these two, these are going to be about 60, 80, 90 pages long. So it's a significant amount of reading, but that's going to be the main work of this class. The main work of this class is going to be reading and analyzing. I'm not asking for a lot of writing. I'm not asking for a lot of assignments, but I am asking for you to read these longer texts with careful attention and to contribute to a productive discussion. You see this further on. So after the great Islamic texts, we have this biography of Charlemagne, and that takes us up to the midterm. So first half of this class, we're going to read a lot. We're going to read a smaller number of longer texts. After the midterm, we have another great text, the Battle of Maldon. We have some more secondary sources, some more sources from scholars. the arguments of scholars, and so we're going to look at those. And then the last 4 weeks of the class, then we revert to perhaps a structure you're more familiar with, a shorter number, shorter texts, but more of them. Apart from this Joinville biography that I have here. Everything else is going to be shorter texts. So I hope that's helpful. I hope that kind of gives you a sense of what I envision for the class. Of course, don't hesitate to contact me, email, phone, Zoom, if you have any questions. I hope you enjoy the course, and I look forward to getting to know all of you and working with all of you.